Tonight, Canada's role in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Some of the Prime Minister's recent statements have focused more attention on the 16-member alliance and the value of the strategies that NATO has been pursuing in Europe, where it faces the forces of the Warsaw Pact. Canada played a major role in the creation of NATO in 1948 and in the deployment of forces in Europe over the decades that followed. But now, by any measure, the Canadian role has diminished.
A couple of months ago, the Prime Minister reacted angrily when senior American officials suggested Canada was not pulling its weight in NATO, but questions about the Canadian contribution have been raised more frequently and more forcefully by NATO allies for 15 years. Are the Canadian forces up to the roles assigned them within the alliance? Are Canadian soldiers ready or not? The Journal's Terence McKenna reports.
The Canadian Forces Base, Baden, West Germany. 22-year-old CF-104 Starfighter jets are rolled out for the regular afternoon practice bombing mission. The old Starfighter fleet is racked with maintenance problems and notorious crashes, and so the pilots have to wait through extra long safety checks and maintenance procedures. They're hoping that the afternoon training mission will not be hampered by the regular delays and disruptions. The time is 1400 hours GMT. At the same hour, it's morning in Ottawa. Canada's new Defence Minister, Jean-Jacques Blais, is getting ready for his first ride in Canada's newest fighter aircraft, the CF-18. It's a familiar publicity exercise for defence ministers, designed to draw attention away from Canada's old and crippled air fleet and highlight the government's new commitment to upgrading the armed forces. Canada now has 25 of the new aircraft, with 113 more on order, total cost $5 billion. The takeoff in Ottawa goes without a hitch. But on the runway in Baden, at the most dangerous part of a starfighter's takeoff, the flight is aborted. The pilot must once again limp back to the hangar. Similar scenes are played out every day in every branch of Canada's armed forces.
At this present time, the Canadian forces, both regular and reserve, are undermanned, under-equipped, and underfunded.
Some of our troops over there have been put in embarrassing situations because, you know, they've been, in essence, insulted by other members of the alliance for the lack of support that the Canadian government has given to our NATO commitments.
But Jean-Jacques Blais takes a different view of things from his vantage point. In spite of a decade of Liberal government defence cuts, he says Canada's ready to meet its commitments to its allies.
We've maintained that commitment that we've made to NATO. We've been one of the few NATO countries to so maintain the commitment, and we're intent on maintaining that commitment.
When the Trudeau government cut Canada's NATO commitment in half in 1970, it came as a major shock to our allies and to our troops. Canadian forces were pulled off the front line and placed in reserve here in Western Germany. For most of 10 years, they watched their equipment and their capability decline, often because defense budgets were frozen. But today, these troops still have important jobs assigned to them, and the Trudeau government says those commitments can be fulfilled. They point to the money they've spent on these new Leopard tanks, money they're going to spend on new ships and planes. But their confidence is not supported by some of the other things you find here at Canadian Forces bases in Europe.
The Canadian forces in action can be an impressive sight. In Germany, there's a mechanized brigade expected to engage Warsaw Pact forces over the Czechoslovakian border. When displaying their power for visiting VIPs, they try their best to fulfill the high expectations of defense ministers. When Jean-Jacques Blais looks at the Canadian forces here, he likes to point out some of the expensive modern equipment they have. He sees an effective army of happy and well-trained men.
We spend more time training. We meet the NATO standards. Very few of the NATO allies meet those standards. And the morale of the troops is immensely high.
No, morale is not high.
Lieutenant Lyle Fast expresses a commonly held view among Canadian troops in Europe. He is free to talk because he has handed in his papers. He's quitting.
They have a lot of pride in being the Canadian troops, but unfortunately we can't back it up with equipment, and they know that, and it's it's a difficult situation because we have to ask these people to fight a war for us, but we're not willing to give them the weapons and the equipment to do it.
A close look at the Royal 22nd Infantry Regiment, even when demonstrating its best attack technique, reveals crucial weaknesses. The men are only issued with chemical and biological warfare training suits, ineffective against a real attack because they're worn and ripped and over-laundered. With their 27-year-old FN rifles, they have to squeeze out the shots one at a time, while their enemies and most of their allies can fire 2 or 3 times that number of bullets with automatic weapons. In the last major exercise, almost 3/4 of their 50 caliber machine guns fired out of control because the barrels were burned out. Many rifles have broken sights that can't be replaced. These soldiers believe such handicaps may cost them their lives. But in the nuclear age, others wonder why it's important for Canada to even maintain a conventional army on foreign soil. Critics say it's a waste of money to have these men play at war games. But Canadian generals like René Gutnick answer that NATO's conventional armies prevent nuclear war.
Any greater time that we could sustain this capacity, our capacity to fight a conventional war, retards the moment at which we have to consider the decision of whether we want to use nuclear weapons first or not. It is not a very popular concept to have to do this, or to have such a policy. We are forced into it by the balance of conventional weapons.
There are others who say that the Canadian soldier in Europe is struggling to keep up with too many assignments, that the government has given them roles they cannot hope to fulfill, that they are rushed into situations they're just not ready for, which angers the soldiers and the defense critics.
I'm of the view that the Liberal governments of the day have really not been sufficiently concerned about the relationship between our commitments to NATO and Western security on the one hand, and our capabilities to fulfill those commitments on the other.
What we have to do is look at the international organizations to which we belong, including NATO, and make sure that we have a credible participation. My view is that we have a credible participation.
In 1970, Canada cut its NATO participation by pulling half its troops back from the European Central Front, and so the alliance removed the rest into the reserve position. The Canadian Navy remained committed to patrolling the North Atlantic shipping lines, and then in 1976, Canada accepted yet another role, a Canada-based rapid deployment force to be transported by air and sea to reinforce Norway. You have to look closely at these 3 major NATO roles to assess the preparedness of Canadian forces. 2.6 million NATO troops face 4 million Warsaw Pact troops across the Central Front on the West German border. If fighting broke out and trouble spots emerged, Canadian troops would be brought in from their reserve position in Lahr, headquarters of the 3,300-man Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group armed with tanks and artillery. In Baden, there is also an 800-man Canadian Air Group. At the Canadian air bases in Germany, there are some indicative problems that are almost too bad to be true. Low-level air defense is one. These anti-aircraft Boffin guns are World War II vintage, pulled off the decks of the scrapped aircraft carrier Bonaventure and installed here, theoretically, to shoot down modern Soviet fighter bombers. These men can fire this gun for real only once a year. They'd have a tough enough time against old propeller planes. To aim them without radar at supersonic attack aircraft is a joke, but it's no laughing matter for the Canadian pilots who fly from this base.
We'll take 30-second spacing between you and me at the target.
Right. The pilots of 441 Squadron plan their practice bombing missions down to the second. They have to approach their work with extreme caution, if not without bravado.
Okay, let's go get our final int brief and walk out, and let's get those guys.
I have 4 104s departing. The wind is 210 at 15 knots.
Lord 18, Slingen Tower, I have your visual along the Rhine. Report clearing in the south.
The pilots here always hope for clear skies because they can't fly the old planes when the weather is bad. So in case of war, they have to hope for good weather. They have to hope the enemy won't take advantage of their vulnerability to attack on the ground. They have to hope there will be enough warning for much of their squadron manpower to be brought over from Canada.
104 is departing. The wind is 210 at 15 knots.
Only 36 of Canada's 54 planes in Europe are manned on a full-time basis. The rest of the pilots have to get over from Cold Lake, Alberta in time for war. The Leopard tank, modern, effective, expensive. Manned by the Royal Canadian Dragoons, these tanks are the core of the mechanized brigade here. But once again, almost half the manpower to operate these tanks will have to be brought over from Canada in time for war. Canada's 58% wartime operational capacity compares to the NATO average of 85%, to the Warsaw Pact's 95%. Former Conservative Defense Minister Alan MacKinnon is worried about the entire Canadian presence in Europe.
Yes, it bothers me as a Canadian that we've made commitments that we're not likely to keep and some that we cannot keep. Everybody you talk to in Europe when you're visiting bases there and troops advise you that this isn't here at this time but will be flown over when things get close to an outbreak of war. And this goes on everywhere you go, you hear the same story.
Handle grips, the gear shifts have a tendency to break because of the frailty of the metal.
Yeah. Equipment that breaks too easily, reinforcements that may not arrive in time, ammunition and supplies that will run out after a few days. This is the predicament of Canada on the Central Front. The Defense Minister hears these stories from the men, but must look at the complaints in relation to even more pressing military shortcomings on other fronts. CAST, the Canadian Air Sea Transportable Force of 4,000 men, is committed to North Norway because of the tactical importance of the region. In war, the entire northern-based Soviet Navy would have to round Norway to enter the Atlantic Ocean. Norwegian air and sea bases would be critical to stopping them, and so a massive Soviet land attack over the Norwegian border is expected. Canada has promised to help repel the attack. But how would 4,000 Canadians get to Norway? Canada's 5 Boeing 707s can each take 170 at a time. Only 92 can go on a Hercules. Canada has only 26 of these with minimal equipment capability. The men would obviously have to move in commandeered civilian aircraft, although there's no announced plan for that. And then they need equipment. They would need 1,200 vehicles, like these armored personnel carriers, that would have to be moved to Norway by sea, with luck in 2 or 3 weeks. But what would happen to these men if they had to fight in the meantime?
You've got a lot of people who are suggesting it would be a repeat of what happened to the Canadians that were sent to Hong Kong shortly after the Japanese invasion there, the Pearl Harbor and Japanese aggression in the Pacific. We dropped in our troops into Hong Kong. Within days, they were all captured, became prisoners of war, and most of them, as you know, died.
If you got those 5,000 or 6,000 Canadian men into the north of Norway, wouldn't the chances are that they'd be waiting a heck of a long time before they got some equipment to fight with?
Oh, no, there'd be a lot of that equipment that would be pre-positioned, so that when they would get there, there would be equipment there available for them to employ.
Is it there now?
Well, we are waiting for the infrastructure funds of NATO to be made available in order to put together the infrastructure required for the pre-positioning.
Soldiers fight with guns, not hypothetical infrastructure funds. The Canadian government accepted the Norway commitment 6 years ago, and yet if these soldiers were dropped into Norway tomorrow, they would have little more than their 27-year-old rifles to defend themselves. There's not a single piece of artillery, not one armored personnel carrier pre-positioned in Norway. There are less than 50 old trucks, cast-offs from the bases in Germany. They are left outdoors because there are no buildings to store them in. But believe it or not, a Canadian soldier could be in a worse position than being dropped unprepared into the middle of a Norwegian winter. He could be in the Navy. The Canadian Navy specializes in submarine detection and anti-submarine warfare, critical because the Warsaw Pact has a 2-to-1 advantage over NATO in long-range attack submarines in the Atlantic area. The Canadian Navy is expected to play a major role in patrolling the North Atlantic sea lines for the reinforcement and resupply of Europe. NATO is officially counting on 20 Canadian destroyer escorts in time of trouble. Nowhere is the neglect of Canada's armed forces more apparent than the Navy. The 15-year forced march to obsolescence means that both the time and the money required for recovery will be staggering. Few of Canada's ships could defend themselves against a modern air attack. None of the ships could stop an Exocet missile. Most of the guns here are World War II vintage.
Engage! Any system, shoot!
Almost all the ships are old steamers. They can't keep up speed with the rest of the NATO fleet. Their ancient boilers are constantly breaking down. These mortar torpedoes are part of the anti-submarine role Canada has taken on in NATO. But according to the latest Senate report, by the time they could be fired, a modern fast Soviet submarine would be gone from the target area. The Senate reported that Canada's Maritime Command couldn't meet its commitments to Canadian sovereignty, let alone to NATO. Only 4 of Canada's 23 ships are considered war-ready, only 6 ships on the drawing board to replace 19 old steamers constantly up for refit.
We must have the most decrepit Navy in the world right now, and it isn't the Navy's fault, it's the politicians' fault. We're going to be waiting for something like another 6 years before we get any new ships, and at that time we will have a total of about 10 ships. And to think of us having a major commitment to look after the northern sea lines is, we simply aren't going to have sufficient fleet to do it.
Aren't you alarmed by the situation in the Navy? You're talking about a Navy which by 1992 will have 10 war-ready ships. Is that an acceptable situation?
We're not going to have. We're going to have much more than 10 war-ready ships. We have now available 17 destroyers, and that we have available, and of those there are a number that are dedicated to the NATO fleet. Why do you try to belittle yourself like that? We are doing the best we can within the budget that is given to us by the Government of Canada, and that budget represents 40% of all the discretionary funds available to the Government of Canada.
We're doing the best with the money given to us by the... You are the government of
That's
Canada.
right. And I'm talking as Minister of National Defense, yeah.
You know, the Navy has been let go in a terrible fashion.
You know, what do you want me to do? I've just signed a $3.2 billion contract this year with a Canadian contractor to build 6 new frigates.
The same 6 new frigates we've been talking about for 4 or 5 years.
Do you want me to go to the Canadian taxpayer and say to them, give me another $6 billion to meet the requirements of the Senate committee? Is that what you want me to do? Where is the $6 billion going to come from?
Let's talk about how much money it would cost to meet our NATO commitments first.
We're meeting them now. We're improving, we're meeting...
You said up to 70%.
Well, yes, but that 70% is superior to most of the NATO allies.
Here at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, you hear the recurring questions about Canada's role in the alliance. Is Canada pulling its weight? Could Canada provide the manpower and the equipment necessary to fulfill the commitments Canada has made to its allies? The allies argue a lot about a fair measure of their relative defense contributions. But, for example, Norway's per capita defense spending is more than double Canada's. Canada spends little more than half of what the Netherlands spends or what Belgium spends. The United States triples Canada's per capita defense spending, and by almost any measure, Canada vies with Luxembourg for last place in defense contributions. As former commander of Allied forces Northern Europe, British General Sir Anthony Farrell-Hockley can assess whether Canada is pulling its weight.
In terms of resource allocation, no, it is not. And I've often thought it's rather strange that, for example, Denmark, with 5 million people, has been attacked at times for not pulling its weight, when in its resource allocation, it has been much higher than that of Canada.
The recent Senate reports argue for critical changes if Canada is to meet its present NATO commitments. They want double the number of men and more equipment on the Central Front. They recommend more men for the CAS Brigade, but suggest that even with better equipment delivery, the commitment to Norway can't be fulfilled. They want double the number of ships in the Navy and say all of this could be paid for with a 12% increase in the annual defense budget. But critics say that would still leave few resources for the defense of Canada itself, that something has to go.
I think they should go over the list of commitments, and some of them we should be honest about and simply say we're not in a position to fulfill that commitment, and I'm sure you don't want us making one we're not going to fulfill, so therefore, starting next year, you'll have to find another nation to do it. And I think the Norwegian one would be a good example to use.
Roderick Byers of the Canadian Institute for Strategic Studies says that Canada has to be more realistic.
The government has to decide whether or not it is going to do something credible in the Central Front or on the northern flank. This is with respect to ground forces. I just can't see us doing both at the current force levels that we have. The last question is our air component in Europe. And I'm of the view that we'd be better off withdrawing that air component and having it entirely stationed in Canada in order to increase our capabilities within Canada and our commitment to North American air defense, given that the Soviets are probably going to deploy a new long-range bomber with an air-launched cruise missile.
This is the other new threat from the Arctic. Now, on top of all other NATO commitments, the Senate is proposing a new NATO role for Canada, the detection and countering of these Soviet submarines in the Arctic region. The Soviets are deploying more subs that can launch cruise and ballistic missiles against North America. Missiles that can be hidden for months at a time under the polar ice in these and newer Soviet nuclear submarines, some over 2 football fields long. They can go faster and dive deeper than any Western submarines. To counter the threat, the Senate recommends that Canada buy 17 new diesel subs that cost far less than surface ships. The government likes the idea. But the generals would resist any redirecting of Canada's resources away from Europe to the Arctic.
I think it's a very short-sighted view, personally, because Canada's first line of defense is in Europe. The stability of Europe is critical to the stability of the world, and obviously the security of our country, since it is tied to alliances, inevitably because of the size of our country.
Are Canadians going to have to learn to pay a lot more for defense than they were paying for the last 10 years?
Canada can't by itself defend itself. As you can well recognize, Canada is the second largest country in the world. So Canada is always elected to defend itself through multilateral alliances. And I have no problems in keeping my head up in deliberations around the NATO table and in participating fully within the alliance. And I have no difficulty in getting Canada recognized as being a major senior partner within that alliance.
Unlike the series of Canadian defense ministers who preceded him, Jean-Jacques Blais will preside over a rapidly expanding defense budget, the expenditure of billions of tax dollars. But money alone will not solve the problems of the Canadian forces. Even with the new ships and planes on the drawing boards, Canada's fighting forces will be too few men with inadequate equipment and too many assignments. Almost every defense observer is saying that the role of the Canadian forces should be redefined. But it appears the present government has neither the time nor the inclination to do that before the next federal election. As always, Canada's fighting forces will just have to be patient. For the Journal, I'm Terence McKenna in Lahr, West Germany.